Here are Ben Shapiro and William Lane Craig to offer weak rebuttals to atheist arguments.
Let's talk about a couple of those philosophy arguments from 101 that are constantly trotted out. I've had similar experiences. The most common one that I've heard, of course, is the problem of evil, the suggestion that how can God be good if so much evil takes place in the world? Yeah. The more sophisticated version of the argument to me is not the problem of human evil, which seems pretty easily disposable.
Let me guess, because of free will? If free will permits humans to do evil things, then why does free will have value? And if free will allows someone to do evil things, does that mean that God does not have free will? If not having free will is good enough for God, why is it not good enough for humans? And if God does have free will, but simply always chooses to never use it for evil, then why couldn't God create humans who also have free will, but never use it to choose to do evil?
But the problem of natural evil things happening to children, a child with cancer. How does a good God rule over a world in which children die of natural causes, in which kids are born with Tay-Sachs, in which horrible things happen to good people?
Yes. In dealing with this problem, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. There is no doubt that emotionally, the evil and suffering in the world make it very difficult to believe in God. It's a tremendous emotional obstacle. But intellectually, considered dispassionately as a philosophical problem, it's extraordinarily difficult to show that there's either any inconsistency or improbability between the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world. The atheist would have to show that it is either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the natural and moral evil in the world.
The only way that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil is if he had a goal which not only outweighed that evil, that is to say, a goal so good that it makes up for that evil, and also if he were unable to accomplish that goal without allowing evil. If he were capable of accomplishing any of his goals without allowing evil, then to accomplish them by allowing evil doesn't seem to me like it would be very omnibenevolent of him. So the only way God can have a morally sufficient reason to allow evil is if this supposedly all-powerful being does not, in fact, have the power to accomplish his goals without allowing evil.
And how could he possibly show that? We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments with any confidence. And so I think that the problem of evil, as difficult as it may be emotionally, intellectually, it lays a burden of proof on the shoulders of the atheist, which is so heavy that it has proved to be unsustainable.
We don't have to show that God does not have morally sufficient reasons to allow evil, because it doesn't matter how great God's reasons for allowing evil are. Even if there is a God who has goals that are so great that they outweigh the evil necessary to accomplish them, if he is unable to accomplish them without allowing evil, then whatever God does exist, if any exists at all, is not the one that is defined as being all-powerful.
And these days, the other argument that is brought up in enormous amount is the supposed backwardness of the Bible itself and biblical morality. This happens largely with regard to, for example, homosexual marriage. It's been brought up with regard to which I think is more, again, easily disposable, because I think there's a solid secular argument in favor of the protection of human life.
There's nothing in the Bible that actually forbids terminating a pregnancy. Renegade Cut recently did a great video all about this, which I will link in the description. Exodus 21:22, for example, prescribes explicitly distinct penalties for mortally wounding a fetus as opposed to mortally wounding an adult. Why would there be distinct penalties for these two acts if the Bible considered a fetus's life to be morally equivalent to any other human's? And this only prescribed punishment for terminally wounding a fetus against the parent's will. It doesn't say that a parent isn't allowed to end their own pregnancy. The Book of Numbers even explicitly recommends ending a pregnancy as a means of testing infidelity.
But homosexual marriage is the one that most often comes up. You also hear arguments that the Bible permits slavery. So if the Bible is so wonderful, then why are there all these weird sections of the Bible where it talks about wiping peoples from the earth, where it talks about enslaving other human beings? Some things that we would certainly consider moral evils today are contemplated by the Bible and not banned by the Bible. So why is that?
Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery. When we hear the word slave, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South.
Here comes the argument that biblical indentured servitude was good, actually.
And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel.
If people were forced to work, then it has the most morally pertinent element in common.
In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off his debts, and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case.
No, not in any case. There are actually two prescribed systems of rules for forced servitude in the Bible. There's the way fellow Israelites were to be treated, and there were the ways in which non-Israelites were to be treated. The rule that says you have to set someone free after they work off their debts actually only applies to fellow Israelites. Exodus 21:2 says, "If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing." Leviticus, however, says that non-Israelites could be forced to work for life. Even when it comes to Israelites, the rules were pretty gross. Yes, you often had to set someone free after 7 years, but Exodus 21:4 says, "If his master give him a wife, and she bear him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself." So any kids you have before you are freed are born into servitude and stay in servitude even after your 6 years are up. And you could not, in this case, keep your family together. Also, if the reason such an institution existed was because there was no social safety net, then wouldn't it have made more sense to command that such a safety net be constructed, at least at the community level?
So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term. This was actually an anti-poverty program.
Was it an anti-poverty program for the non-Israelites who were captive for life?
And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working.
Yeah, having to do unpaid labor to work off a debt for 6 years is much better for your sense of self-respect.
Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect. He worked for an income. He paid his debts. He kept his family together. And that, to call that slavery, is just a gross misrepresentation.
Is it a gross misrepresentation to use that word to describe the non-Israelites who could be forced to work for life? And also, if he got married to and had children with a woman given to him by the guy holding him captive, then once he was set free, he could not keep his family together. His family would still be someone's property.
Now, the first thing you mentioned, I've forgotten.
Homosexual marriage,
Yeah,
same-sex
okay.
marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Everything is socioculturally relative.
That would be a good rebuttal if the argument were God is violating an independently existing objective moral standard. That's not an argument I would ever make. I don't believe in objective good or evil. I'm pointing out that I don't see how God meets his own standards of goodness if he allows things that he would himself consider evil while being perfectly capable of achieving all of his goals without allowing evil.
So who's to say that the moral values of a society that discriminates against people and oppresses people is worse than one which is liberal and tolerant? We just sort of assume that the liberal values are the ones that would be objective, when in fact they're just as relativistic as any of the other ones on atheism.
They would be relativistic even if there is a God. Even if you have such a being dictating moral rules to us, there is still no non-circular objective reason why we ought to follow those rules.
So if we need God to be the anchor point for objective moral values and duties,
we don't. My argument is that God doesn't seem to follow his own moral standards. Not that he defies some rules I believe to be objective. If he is all-powerful, then the only goal that would be impossible for him to achieve is one which is logically contradictory. The only goal that is logically impossible to achieve without allowing evil is evil itself. So if God is all-powerful, then he is allowing that which he considers to be evil for the sake of that which he considers to be evil.
we cannot escape the question, when thinking of moral right and wrong, well, what does God think of this? And if God proscribes something, it seems to me that's entirely within his right. If God were to say, thou shalt not eat beans, or thou shalt not eat pork, that would be our moral duty, and we should obey it. That is his prerogative as the moral lawgiver and the supreme good.
Again, there is no non-circular explanation of why this is the case. If whatever God does is good simply because God does it, then to say that God is good or is the supreme good becomes a meaningless tautology. By this logic, if God comes to earth in human form and drops a deuce in your Fruit Loops, then that is good merely because it was God who did it.
And so if God says, my plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage, that's his prerogative.
Again, there is no non-circular reason why anyone should grant that assertion.
By the same token, in the movement of people who are not inside the Israelite, inside the Jewish kind of tradition, that's not proscribed. So the idea of war captives is obviously taken into account and not banned. So certain things are banned in the Bible, certain things are not banned. Now, the way that biblical believers have practiced over time is that very early in the church's history, they're already starting to eliminate slavery, although not for people who are captured. And then over time, the West is the first place to eliminate slavery altogether.
Altogether is very questionable, but the first emperor of the Ming dynasty tried to ban slavery hundreds of years before any Western power ever even made an attempt. Apologists would like us to believe that abolitionism is an idea that nobody who isn't a Judeo-Christian could come up with.
Specifically citing the sections of the Bible that talk about human freedom and the innate value of every human being. So is that an evolution of morality, or is that a realization of a fundamental principle that was originally given to people who couldn't necessarily understand the full extent of the principle?
Oh, I think it's the latter, and I love the way you put it. I think that's nicely put.
So even though the Bible explicitly says you are allowed to take captives and force them into servitude, what it actually wanted was for that to be abolished, and it just took a while for people to figure out that this is what the Bible actually recommends? If this is true, then this is another case of this supposedly divinely inspired, infallible document apparently being written by someone with the communication skills of a hat rack going through a wood chipper.
Jesus said something very much like this with respect to Old Testament regulations on divorce. They asked him whether or not it was lawful to divorce a woman for any reason, and Jesus said, Moses allowed you to write a certificate of divorce, but it was not so from the beginning. And he cites then the creation story of Genesis of Adam and Eve and said, what God has put together, and let not man put asunder. So what Jesus was saying there was that the law of Moses was a temporary prescription accommodating the hardness of heart of the people at the time, but it didn't represent the perfect will of God for human marriage, which was grounded in the creation story.
So what God actually wants is for forced servitude to be abolished, despite the fact that the Bible explicitly permits it, and for divorce to be abolished, despite the fact that the Bible explicitly permits it? What other hidden meanings might we discover in the future? What else is going to turn out to be a temporary accommodation for the hardness of people's hearts? Or have we got it all figured out now?
When it comes to same-sex marriage, the argument is now being made by people in liberal churches, including Pete Buttigieg, who's running for president, that basically Jesus was seeking equal respect for everyone. He cared about the least of these, and the prescriptions on homosexuality were really more, and homosexual activity were not eternal precepts, but were really attempting to crack down on the promiscuity of the time, or they were temporary expedients.
Yeah, I think that's clearly false. When you look at these regulations, both in the Old Testament and then they're repeated in the New Testament in the strongest terms in Romans chapter 1, there's no doubt that Paul is thinking of this as a moral law that has abiding significance.
But Paul also says in Ephesians 6:5 that captive servants should obey their masters. That gets repeated in the New Testament too, so why doesn't that have abiding significance? Clearly, the mere fact that the New Testament repeats something is not pertinent to its permanence as a biblical moral prescription.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.